All right, the hell with it. I did not want to do this movie. I did not want to talk about Legally Blonde. I'm not a fan of Reese Witherspoon. I've dated way too many attorneys, so I'm dealing with my own PTSD when I had to go back and watch this movie. And I don't even like the color pink. But I do like Kristalyn Shefveland and Jennifer McCutchen, two of my best friends in academia, two women who I hold in incredibly high regard, two of the rising scholars, top scholars, working in the Native South today. And when I asked them, what movie do we want to do? They both looked at me and said, we're going to make you suffer. We're doing Legally Blonde. Legally Blonde comes out in the summer of 2001, right before the world changes. And that in itself means that it is a moment in time. It's a historical artifact. But as Kristalyn and Jennifer are going to talk about today, this movie has a ton of things to say about society. Really at the end of the 90s, at the end of the long 90s, and what we kind of get back to this idea of the end of an age of innocence, if you will. And Legally Blonde has so much to say. On the surface, it's the story of a young woman who goes off to law school to prove something, but it has so much more to say about society at this point in time. We can talk about shattering glass ceilings, infiltrating old boys clubs, East Coast versus West Coast, old money versus new money, fashion, performative perceptions, whether or not it's okay to be a fan of pop culture, and the things actually that we wrestle with as attorneys, as men and women, as scholars. This movie has a lot actually to talk about. And I was kind of surprised at where this conversation goes. It goes so many different directions. We're going to end up talking about law school, graduate school, the processes of getting graduate students through graduate school, the difficulties of that, the roles that women have to encounter or have to perform, and the expectations for women in law school, academia, things that are different for women than they are for men. And what this movie has to say about all of these things. This is a fun conversation. So get ready, because Legally Blonde is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Kristalyn, Jennifer, how are you today?
I'm great.
Doing pretty good.
I have one important question for the both of you. Coke or Pepsi?
Oh, Coke.
Mountain Dew.
Oh, that is a out of left field answer. I'm Coke all the way.
So for the record, Jennifer is a good person and Kristalyn is just off in her own sphere, enjoying the extremes of soda. So for people who aren't familiar with you, where are you guys from? Like, what do you do? Like, what's your role over at your respective universities? Chris?
Okay, I am an associate professor of history at the University of Southern Indiana, which is in Evansville, Indiana. Ignore anything you think you know about Indiana, because I don't live in that part of Indiana and I don't know anything about it. I basically live in Kentucky. Kentucky is directly behind me. I can get to it by hopping over a couple islands and a river, but it's not far by any stretch of the imagination. I'm also an interim assistant dean of the College of Liberal Arts and the graduate director for the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies.
Chad, what about you? Where are you at?
Well, geez, I have to follow that. So I'm Jen McCutchen. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of St. Thomas, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. Previously, I was at the University of Southern Maine, which was also a lovely institution in Portland, Maine. And at St. Thomas, I teach courses in early American history, colonial history, Native American history, and I am loving every minute of it.
So you're in St. Paul. So the three of us actually all have weird Minnesota ties, right? So you're in St. Paul right now. I obviously went to University of Minnesota many years ago. And then, Kristalyn, you also have like your family ties in Minnesota?
I'm from Minnesota. I was born in Wabash.
Okay, so actually in Minnesota.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about something important before we get into the film, which is why are Minnesota people so awful? Go.
Awful. I thought you were going to say awesome. I think Minnesota people are awesome.
Did I say awful? I mean awesome.
Minnesota people put tater tots on everything, and you can't. I mean, if that's not awesome, I don't know what is.
Okay, so I was literally thinking earlier today about the whole tater tot thing. I was like, because for people outside Minnesota, and I'm kidding about the people being awful bit, just so people understand. Am I? I don't know. The tater tot thing is real. Like, they have this dish called hot dish. Can someone explain to people who are outside of Minnesota what hot dish is?
A hot dish is for those who are not blessed to be from Minnesota, a casserole of sorts that usually involves traditionally using a Campbell's cream-based soup and some sort of potatoes and vegetables, a meat of your choice, and as little spice as possible. 0 spice. Ketchup might be too spicy. And it's a nice, congealed, fantastic, stick to your ribs because it's freezing comfort food. That's what it is. It's basically like you would get a chicken pot pie sort of thing. And instead of having a crust, you've got tater tots.
Yeah. You basically put tater tots on a casserole.
Yeah, if tater tots is good, you should put tater tots on things and then call them new dishes, I suppose. But, Chris was just talking about this word nice a lot, and that shows up a lot when we talk about Minnesota. Before we get into the film, I want to talk, what is Minnesota nice? What is this about?
The worst thing that I could ever say to you, Jason, is to call you different.
Oh,
mm-hmm. That's true.
Because that's an insult. So Minnesota nice is about not being very direct, but it's a tactic to not appear to be rude. So instead of insulting someone by saying bless your heart, which is what Southerners like to do, they will say things along the line. So my mother, for example, if I were to tell her about something that I was doing that she may or may not agree with, she will say, well, that's different, which means she doesn't like it and it's a very bad idea, but she's not going to actively insult me. She's going to just say, that's different.
Well, I want to ask you both then today, we talked a lot about going back and forth where we're putting this whole thing together, what film to do. The three of us all kind of study the American Southeast in some form or fashion. So naturally that meant we chose to do Legally Blonde. Why?
It's a generation movie. It's a movie that everyone who was of a certain age when it came out were deeply inspired by, from the fashion to the representations of femininity. For me as a female scholar, the entire conversation around how you are supposed to portray yourself in order to be perceived as intelligent hit very close to home. I had just graduated from undergrad at that point and was trying to determine whether I wanted to go to law school or grad school for history. And those were conversations that my friends and colleagues were having. And it's something that, while it's also funny, it has a lot of import for women of a certain age.
I would agree. I think that Legally Blonde is such an important movie for just not only female academics or female law students or, women who are in these traditionally male-dominated fields, but for women anywhere to be like, just be yourself. And that's great. And it's encouraged. And if you are being yourself and portraying yourself in your most honest, truthful way, then you'll be successful and you'll be confident. And that's what you need in order to really thrive in whatever field you are in. And so that's, one of the things that speaks to me about the movie really, really strongly.
My ex-wife is obviously an attorney. She spoke a lot about the idea when she reflect back on into going into law school and then becoming an attorney, the idea that she was infiltrating like an old boys club in her line of work. Did you feel like, as scholars, as historians, that there was any kind of like a parallel for you as far as entering that domain at all? I mean, I'm interested in the idea of like, what is to be a woman scholar, professor? Are there differences? Do you still feel like there's this idea of a place that you're a glass ceiling that you're shattering going into? Are there direct parallels to that?
I think there are a lot of parallels between the old guard and the new guard, even in the disciplines that we're in, and in a field that is much more equitable than other aspects of history, that there's spaces for us where we feel quite welcome, from graduate students all the way up to senior scholars. And then there are other spaces where there is a very clear hierarchy, and that graduate students do not speak. And you, as even early career faculty, you don't get to speak until you are spoken to by certain levels of the academy.
I think too, like, it's interesting in the classroom as well, because, there are situations where, as female professors, like, students don't maybe necessarily take us as seriously as they might male professors. And I haven't really encountered that, but my husband is also an academic, and he teaches some of the same kind of survey level courses that I teach. And, sometimes his reviews look a lot different than mine, and we're teaching very similar things. And so I think that's also some kind of choppy waters for us as, female academics to sometimes navigate as well, especially when you think about the weight that student evaluations, for example, have when it comes to you moving up in your profession, from assistant to associate professor, or from associate to full professor, getting tenure, all of these things. And so I personally feel like I've been very lucky in that I have had really great students, and I feel overall that I've had really lovely relationships with my students. But I know that generally, on the whole, sometimes that is a really difficult situation to navigate for a lot of female professors that male professors sometimes don't have to deal with in the same type of way.
The film itself, that we were talking about other ideas in this film that were interesting to you. Kristalyn, you had said fashion of the Y2K fashion. What does this movie have to tell us about fashion in the early 2000s? I say this while wearing cargo shorts.
I say this while wearing pink. So what is really, really interesting about this film as a fashion timepiece is we have to remember and go back into our own Wayback Machines that there were very few fashion blogs or websites for inspiration for outfits at that time. And so Hollywood films and television shows really became the set piece for what's going to end up in the mall and end up at spaces, and how individuals are going to be emulating that fashion. Now it's much more of an Instagram, social media world where you can get ideas of what to wear and put things together. But this was a time period where it's gossip blogs, very much focused on Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, those types of folks. And they embodied a very distinct sense of femininity. And pink was, an incredibly important color. Of course, pink as a brand for Victoria's Secret was also just getting its start. And it was taking the sort of co-ed aspects of an Abercrombie and making it distinctly feminine and feminine colors. And what we see embodied in the film, though, is this incredible wardrobe. A lot of the pieces are actually vintage or had been sourced, thrifted by the designer for the film, but it creates an entire generation of folks who are emulating. Ariana Grande did a whole video, that had parts of the film in it. But again, going back to what I had said earlier, the idea that a woman could be intelligent and care deeply about fashion and not be simply vapid or, quite frankly, stupid is a huge theme for the movie. But it's also something that I know that women face quite regularly. And you talk about dressing for the classroom, that there are, I have male colleagues who could show up in athletic shorts and still command respect.
Well, they're cool, right? When they do that. Oh,
they
they're
come
like,
across
they're
as cool,
down.
perhaps, but if a woman is daring in what she wears or fashionable, it's often viewed that she, again, that word vapid comes to mind. She is more interested in popular culture than perhaps she's interested in spending time in the archives, so to speak.
That's such a great response, Chris, because I totally was thinking so many of the same things. And I have really leaned into my love of pop culture. And I'm very honest and open with like my students and my colleagues about it. I have like stickers all over my office door that are like Bravo Real Housewives quotes and like, just things that I feel like tell the people that I work with every day and tell my students, like, this is who I am. And it doesn't mean that I'm not intelligent. And it doesn't mean that I don't care deeply about history or my career. But this is also who I am. And like on the weekends for fun, yeah, I'm binging Real Housewives because that's what I enjoy doing, And I do look to Legally Blonde and other films of the era that have all the themes that you have been highlighting, Chris, as kind of inspiration, and also like kind of for me to look at and be like, it's okay that I lean into these parts of my personality because this is who I am, and I don't want to dedicate my life to this career for the next however many decades without being able to honestly show and express like who I am and the things that I enjoy. And yeah, I think like Legally Blonde is such a groundbreaking film for women to basically say like it's okay for you to lean into the things that you like and the other things that you find enjoyment in or are passionate about outside of being in the archives, outside of being in academia. And I think it's made me feel like more confident in a way to basically just say, hey, this is who I am. Like, I love researching and writing about the Native South, and I love teaching about these really important topics, historical topics, but I also really love like going on Reddit and reading the latest gossip about the Real Housewives. So, it's great. It's awesome to be able to look to a movie like Legally Blonde and say like, wow, this movie, which came out 20 plus years ago, probably like already was starting to get the wheels in motion when we think about these things.
Chris said a thing just a second ago about the idea that, women who were into fashion could be perceived as vapid, which I had never really thought of before. And I guess maybe a lot of this, watching this film, was kind of exposing a lot of things that maybe that I might take for granted, not being a woman, these perceptions and things like that, which is part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you about this. And, as Kristalyn was saying this, I immediately thought about James Bond, of all people, right? Who is a man who is very clearly into fashion, right? We talk about Bond, the suits he wears, the watches, the way that he wears, whatever it is. And under those circumstances, do we ever consider him to be vapid? This is like an admirable thing for this very fashionable man to be, displaying these traits and qualities. And I'd never really thought about that, about why that might be considered as a negative, especially for an academic or an attorney, or I would imagine physicians would also be. Is this a contrast? Is there a threat? And I remember talking to my ex-wife about this, about how she always said that people, a lot of times, because she was an attorney, felt threatened by her intelligence and things like that. Is this also a thing that maybe you felt as scholars, or just talking to other women in the profession or throughout academia? Is it just the idea that pop culture and fashion are somehow maybe not threatening the men, whereas intelligence might be? There seems to be some kind of like tension between these two ideas.
I personally have not felt that way. However, I have not been in academia or the biz for as long as maybe some other women have. Like I got my first job in 2019. I finished my PhD in 2019. I will say that like I have been really lucky to have been in departments and have been in a graduate program where I did feel very supported by male colleagues, and even as a graduate student by my advisor who was a male. So I don't know if it's more of like a recent shift, and for somebody who's really new on this career path to feel like I have been really supported. But I certainly think that if you were to ask other women who have been in this career for longer, they would probably have a different answer.
Well, on that vein, there were a few years when I first started out that I was taking all the advice about how I was supposed to present myself, how I was supposed to talk. And full disclosure, I was in a sorority and I'm a very girly girl and have always been. And I made a concerted effort to take like and out of my speaking and to change the tonality of my voice, because this is advice I was receiving from women about going on the market and presenting myself. I additionally have been told frequently to be less blonde. I've always been blonde. Sometimes my hair is a little bit darker. Sometimes it's a little bit lighter, but I have tried to dye my hair dark. It doesn't take. But when I did try to dye my hair dark, I was told by several faculty members that I looked more sophisticated. And I read that as more intelligent. And I was told, be less blonde, be less bubbly. Basically, don't be you. And I tried it. And I did receive it. I perceived it that I was taken more seriously, but I was also miserable. It wasn't me. It wasn't how I talked. And I also didn't want to move in circles where I had to wear a mask and play act all the time. Now, certainly there's going to be some code switching between how I would talk normally with a friend or a family member versus how I would speak at a academic conference. Certainly, absolutely. But if I'm a little loud or have a little bit of a high-pitched voice when I'm excited, or what is described as manic energy, which is really just female energy, deal with it. Or we don't have to work together and be in circles with one another. And that was his choice that I made, because it was against all the advice that I was receiving. And again, keep in mind, I graduated in 2010. Things have changed significantly, but this was advice I was getting from advisors, faculty, other graduate students. You would do your mock interviews and they would say, be less bubbly. You're too enthusiastic. You're too blonde. You should probably figure out something else to do with your hair. Wear less makeup. Try to de-prettify yourself. And that's bizarre advice when I think about it now, but it was completely normal back in the day.
Yeah. And you're saying, you're getting this advice in 2009, 2010. And so, I'm going on the market in 2018, 2019, and not receiving as much of that advice as you did. However, it's interesting to me what you're saying, because as women, it's always like we're trying to be too much of something. So, you have people telling you, oh, well, you're too bubbly, you're too blonde, you're too enthusiastic about this. But if you weren't enthusiastic enough, then the criticism would be, well, you're not showing enough enthusiasm about your research, or you're not showing enough excitement about what you do, and you need to be more passionate and you need to appear more dedicated. And it's just one of those double-edged swords, whereas women, you feel like you can never really find that sweet spot. You're either too much of something, or then you're too much in the opposite direction. And I still think that that's something that we have to figure out how to navigate as women in academia today, for sure.
Are these criticisms, Jennifer, were they also coming from women, from say, elder women who were maybe farther along in the career path than you, or were they men, or how does that work?
I think thinking back to my career, especially as a graduate student, like I truly did not experience a lot of the things that like Chris is talking about. However, I do remember receiving, I guess maybe sometimes what I would consider to be unsolicited advice, in big air quotes, from other females in academia. And so I could think of like the specific examples that I would kind of categorize as unsolicited advice, coming from mostly other women, but also packaged as, listen, I'm going to tell you this because I want to help you, or I want to prepare you, or I want to make sure that you are not in a situation where somebody else is going to tell you this. So just FYI, and so, yeah, I would say generally, like thinking about my experiences, a lot of that type of advice was coming from other women in academia as opposed to men in academia.
I would agree. It was all well intentioned. It was, there be dragons. I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to make sure that you are successful, or these are the things that they've experienced, or things that were said to them, or that they anticipated, or what have you. It was never malintended. It was always coming from a place of, we want you to be successful and to be prepared.
Yeah. And I think that's like a testament too to a lot of, like my experiences with like my advisor or other men in academia too, where like, they were very careful about like not to bring those things up with me. And I did appreciate it. But I do think that the women that I encountered, especially as a graduate student, felt like, well, it's my obligation to perhaps like provide you with advice on these issues because, I'm a woman, you're a young woman in academia, almost like a mentorship relationship, how they looked at it. And this is something that would probably be inappropriate for a male faculty member to address with you. So I want to step in and do it in a way that's appropriate. So again, like agreeing with what Kristalyn has said, like never really malintended, always in the vein of like, I want to support you and help you and set you up for success. So that was something to keep in mind as well.
How does sorority culture affect this whole film? Like the major theme in this film. And Kristalyn, you said you were in a sorority. What sorority was this? Can you disclose said information?
I am an active alum member of Alpha Omicron Pi.
Of which one?
Alpha Omicron Pi, which started at Barnard College at Columbia University, and was from the very beginning deeply, deeply devoted to diversity. And so it's an incredible space and organization. But I can tell you from the movie, yeah, it's spot on. They clearly had done their research on every aspect, from the house to pinning ceremonies and the anticipation of an engagement, to how girls would get together. It's very, very accurate to sorority culture.
Jennifer, were you also in a sorority or a Meredith sorority? I don't know how the correct words here.
I was actually a member of Gamma Phi Beta for a short, brief period of time, but I ended up not really being an active alumni member to the point where Chris is probably very involved in the alumni happenings of her sorority. I went to a very small school that did not have the type of, like, it had Greek life, but not like we're seeing in Legally Blonde at all. Like, there were no houses. There were only a couple of sororities or fraternities to choose from. And so my experience in a sorority was very, very different from what we're seeing in Legally Blonde. And like the philanthropic nature of it was really cool. And I really thought that that was an awesome piece of Greek life at the university level. But we weren't seeing like how it's being depicted as Legally Blonde. I actually feel like when I went to TCU as a graduate student, I got kind of a better idea of what true like Greek life was supposed to look like. And it was really kind of interesting and also really refreshing to see like how Greek life operates at a larger university where a huge significant part of the undergrad population are members of a sorority or a fraternity. So that was actually really interesting, especially in comparison to like my experience.
Do either of your schools have like strong Greek life now?
We have a modest Greek life. It's not in any way commensurate to any other university that I've been at. It's growing, but they have suites, but they don't have houses.
Yeah, St. Thomas does not have Greek life.
I think most people know that I flunked out of Murray State University twice. And I was always too terrified to either like join in on a fraternity or even, my God, talk to a woman in a sorority, especially AOPI, which was like, that was like the upper class. Like I felt there was like this class system at the university where like AOPI was like, that was the best. And anyone that Jason could date would be actually much farther down, actually beyond at the bottom, but actually not at the university or part of a like human race. So that was what I always felt like. There was a very well delineated like sense of like, okay, there's AOPI, and then there was like for the fraternities, there was also an equivalent like somewhere on the scale. There seemed to be from the outside in, there always seemed to be like this classist institute, like, okay, those are the jocks, or those are the party guys, those are the nerd guys, and so forth. Again, I wasn't around long enough to really make those, to find out very, very well. So I was always kind of fascinated, of course, because growing up, we saw all these movies that were very heavy, featuring fraternity sororities. I remember, Revenge of the Nerds being my first introduction to that, and probably not the most accurate, though. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, fraternity culture is an entirely different animal. And Animal House was actually based off of Defiance College in Ohio. It was, stereotypes exist for a reason about fraternity life. Sorority life, yes, it is absolutely a tiered system, and it varies from campus as to where your chapter might rank per se in terms of popularity level. But what's really fascinating, and that is displayed in the film, is that if you are active in an alum network, and active, across, the ages and across your time, that you do have a built-in system of people to connect with and to have the opportunity to network with. And that has been something that I've carried with me throughout my career as well. There's an AOPI chapter here at the University of Evansville, and I've acted as a chapter advisor for them. And when I first moved here, to have an outlet outside of the university to meet people, and for lack of a better way to describe it, people who spoke fairly similarly to me in terms of life interests and life experiences, to have that and to know that there is a club or a chapter or a space that you can connect with. I view it now, it's no different than like a Kiwanis or, a Rotary Club. They're in these installments all over the place, and you just know that it's like-minded individuals, and you can work together and do philanthropy and get connected into a community above and beyond just trying to get your classes set forth and, survive the first few years of the tenure track, to have an outlet in a space that, similar people are at.
And I love too, like, going back to Legally Blonde, how the sorority is depicted in that movie. Like, you really truly see how it's a space where women are supporting other women. Like, when Elle wants to try to get into law school and she knows she has to get like a 178 on her LSAT or whatever, you see all these scenes of her sisters being like, we're going to help you study and we're going to time you while you take your practice LSAT test. Or then when she is like, arguing the case in the courtroom, her two friends fly out from California and they're like, we love you, Elle, and so I love how the sorority is depicted as like women supporting other women, even if their interests are a little bit different. And that to me is like sorority in its best form, right? Is really being a space where women can support other women and have each other's backs and like come together, even though they might have other differences of opinions. And like, I loved how that was depicted in Legally Blonde as well. That's really inspirational to me.
So you're telling me the sororities operate opposite, say, something like the American Historical Association? Are sororities concerned with presentism?
Sororities are, often very, very equity-minded and concerned about issues of social justice and environmental justice. And their members are often some of the biggest student leaders across campus and are networking to try to build better communities. Oftentimes, that's what I've run into.
Yeah, they're philanthropic organizations at their core. And the philanthropy that each sorority or fraternity identifies with or supports is different. But yeah, I would agree with Kristalyn for sure.
Jen, you just kind of mentioned her friends flying out from California. And we're talking a little bit about this class thing and so forth. Kristalyn is smiling at me right now because I'm literally just pulling off of a text thread that she said earlier. In case some of you thought that like I did a lot of work on this thing, no, not at all. I'm just like, mostly what I'm doing is letting Kristalyn tell me what to say, because this is kind of how our friendship has operated for the last 6 years. So Kristalyn has suggested that perhaps we talk about East Coast versus West Coast old money versus new money. I'm thinking, of course, Puffy versus Tupac. But in this case, that's different. So maybe you guys could take your stab at that.
What is the idiom that money speaks and wealth whispers? New money has to be ostentatious and likes to show brands, and it's gauche, and old money, they're still driving a Mazda and it's fallen apart. But they have, a winter house and a lake house and, several summer houses out on the Cape, and they're probably falling apart to a certain extent. I'm thinking Grey Gardens esque, concepts, but new money is California, and it's bright and it's shiny and it's ostentatious. And that's what I really think we see with Elle and Vivian.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, not to bring this back to Real Housewives, but I try to always bring this back to Real Housewives.
Absolutely bring this back to Real Housewives.
Like if you could visualize like the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills in comparison to the Real Housewives of New York City, like, I think that is a great example of like old money, New York City, new money, Beverly Hills. I mean, the Beverly Hills women are like head to toe in labels and glam for every single scene. And they also, there are quite a few Beverly Hills housewives who are allegedly involved in some shady financial dealings. And then you look to the Real Housewives of New York City, and I think, you don't see that ostentatious display of wealth like you do in the Beverly Hills franchise, and totally representative of that dichotomy between Elle and Vivian that Chris mentioned as well. And I think like when Warner is saying, I can't be with a girl like you, Elle, I have to be with somebody like Vivian because that's what my parents expect of me. You totally see it's about that old money versus new money and that ostentatious display of wealth that Elle is kind of putting out there. What does she say? Something like, I grew up across the street from Aaron Spelling. Like, why would you not want to be with me? And, to her, that is a symbol of wealth, right? Like, I've made it. Like, I grew up across the street from Aaron Spelling. Like, how could you not want me to be a part of your family? But then when we see the reasons why Warner is kind of gravitating toward Vivian, that doesn't matter as much to his old money family. It's more about the house on the Cape or the house on Long Island or the house in the Hamptons, etc.
Well, and it's also interrelated with the old guard, that these New England and New York and East Coast families can trace themselves back to either Mayflower or First Family of Virginia, and that in order to have membership to the country club or to the athletic club, it's dependent upon who you're descended from and connected with. It doesn't matter how much money you have. And that buying into these spaces is a very new American thing and a new money thing. And that we could then, of course, have deeper conversations about what was happening in the 19th century with robber barons and these new families who were creating wealth, and now they are the lineal families of prestige. So just give it enough time, and then you will be the family of prestige. But again, it comes back to we're a society that's deeply influenced by radical Protestants who believed in no classes, quite literally the levelers, not to have any social distinctions. So I feel that we are often in a push and pull within our society because we have these, we don't want to have honorifics, and we don't want to have to cross the street if a social better is coming our way, so to speak. And we have these very democratic mannerisms, but we also become highly obsessed with status.
I think one of the things I'm really curious about as I rewatched this film was the idea that, Elle ends up with Emmett, and obviously Elle's relationship kind of sets this whole film in her previous relationship sets this whole film into order. Does this movie need the romantic side plot with Luke Wilson? Does it help it, hurt it? And also, why do I continue to date attorneys?
Well, Jason, that deserves its whole own podcast episode to answer that second question. I look at that side romance with Emmett, and he's obviously so supportive of her and like encouraging her and sees the potential in her and sees the intelligence of her that, you know, in a lot of ways, this could have been just like your stereotypical romantic comedy, like side plot. But I think in this case, like, it is the story of a relationship of partners. And he sees her as somebody of equal intelligence to him, and he wants to build her up and he wants to support her because he sees beyond, you know, the pink and the glamour and the, you know, presentation of Elwood's. And for that reason, I really like that romantic side plot in this movie because he is the one who is encouraging her and has her back every step of the way. And I like that as opposed to some other directions that this side plot of romance could have taken. So I think it's kind of necessary for the movie, and I'm glad that it's in there.
Well, there's two things. One, there's a rumor that she was supposed to end up with Vivian at the end. And so that's a fun internet rabbit hole for y'all to explore if you're not aware of it already. But
No idea. I had no idea about that.
The other thing is that this is at a time where it would not have been possible to produce a film without a romantic subplot. That she rides off into the sunset on her own wouldn't have happened. I cannot imagine a Hollywood producer at that time writing off on, okay, it's just a film about friendship. Because think about all of the films about female friendship that are also coming out at that time. Every single one has a romantic subplot, regardless of whether it even makes sense within the film. There's always a partner involved, a heteronormative partner involved.
You know, I can't help but just remember now that both Reese Witherspoon and Selma Blair were both in Cruel Intentions.
Yes. I was trying to remember if it came up before or after. It came up before, yeah.
I think also Ryan Phillippe was in Cruel Intentions, and that's how they met, correct?
That's where they met, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Sarah Michelle Gellar in there as well.
Yeah, but I agree with you, Chris. There's no way that this could have been a movie without, like, Elle finding her soulmate, air quotes, and riding off into the sunset. Like, this is early 2000s. This was billed as a romantic comedy. Like, it had to have, you know, had to have that subplot to it.
We've talked a lot about our mutual love, Jennifer, you especially, of pop culture, of reality shows, and what they might say about our own realities. I wonder if we could kind of talk a little bit about our favorite ones briefly and talk. I usually use this point to say, hey, scholars, let's talk about what our books influence us the most and how that affects our scholarship. But I also think that might be bullshit and feel like pop culture does, in fact, influence us. It does, in fact, influence the way we look about the world. And I absolutely say embrace the shit out of it, because if that's what we like, you spend all this damn time reading and professing the knowledge given to you through years of study, coming down from the gods of wisdom. Like, sometimes I just want to watch people fight on TV. So, 3 favorite pop culture shows? Go.
Well, I made a concerted effort not to watch any reality television until I got tenure. And then I started watching Southern Charm, which I then turned into a research project, because that's what I do, is find a way to turn even my pop culture interests into, you know, a take on historical memory. And all because I was like, the Ravenels. I know the Ravenels. I've studied the Ravenels in colonial South Carolina. I'm going to watch this show. And of course, it's fantastic debauchery. So I love Bravo. I mean, Bravo is my space. Southern Charm has always been my absolute favorite. I watch all the Below Deck franchises. And that's funny because it intersects with my, you know, Florida folks and Florida spaces, because I ran into a bunch of the Below Deck people because they're all right there in Fort Lauderdale or up in Melbourne. Occasionally they're hanging out in Vero. So, you know, it's very strange crossing of worlds. But I'll tell you what, my family right now is completely obsessed with Scandal and what's happening with Vanderpump Rules. And so any blogs, any podcasts, Dumas, All of the gossip sites. My daughter and I are rewatching Vanderpump Rules, and she's yelling at the screen. She's very Team Ariana. Has always been Team Ariana, and yeah, I mean that the last 2 weeks have been her sending me things that she's seen and me letting her know what I've seen, and yeah, it's a lot. We just went ahead and leaned into it because it's all we're talking about anyways. Like we might as well just start from the very beginning. She doesn't like Stassi. She's never liked Stassi. She yells a lot about Stassi at the screen. And we've had some conversations about maybe you shouldn't be supportive of Team Jax. Maybe that's not the way to go, my daughter of mine, but allow her to make her own opinions as we progress through.
Chris, you're speaking my love language. I love Bravo. I am a huge, I'm a Real Housewives super fan. I watch all of them. I love them all equally. I guess maybe
Is there a hierarchy of housewives?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Hierarchy
Which is the OG?
Of individual housewives or the franchises?
Of the franchises.
The franchise started in Orange County, but New York put it on the map.
Okay. Yeah. And me personally, my favorite franchise is Jersey. But if you ask anybody, I'm sure anybody is going to have a different favorite franchise. So yeah, there's a hierarchy. And then of course there's a hierarchy in who your favorite housewife is. But I love Housewives. I'm also very invested in the Scandival right now because I am a VPR fan, currently doing a rewatch of season 6, which starts where we find out that Jax cheated on Brittany with Faith. So definitely doing a rewatch of that right now. And then I also love Below Deck. I absolutely love Below Deck. I love all of the different ones. I've watched them all, even the ones on Peacock. Yeah, very jealous that you have run into some Below Deckies in the wild. I want to learn more about this. This is amazing.
Kate is really, really nice.
I'm sure. She's
really nice.
Had a Below Deck for seasons. She's one of my favorite Bravo celebrities. So yeah, that's awesome. I am not in the same camp of Kristalyn as saying that I will not watch reality TV until I get tenure. I need it. It's it's like the junk food for my brain. So I am definitely all in on reality TV.
All right, so I want to actually bust this all the way back because we're talking about Real Housewives. We're talking about this kind of stuff, hierarchy. What's the OG reality TV? Is it?
It's Real World.
It's Real World, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be.
Yeah, it's the Real World New York, which you can watch their reunion. This is how deep I've gone into reality TV, by the way. I've made up for the time, Jen. You can watch the reunion on the Paramount Network.
Wow.
They went back and did a reunion. They did a reunion for New Orleans, too, which that one was really interesting. But yeah, it's the Real World. That sets everything up for what's to come.
An honorable mention, I would say, especially for my generation, is The Simple Life with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah.
When Paris Hilton has that scene where she thinks that Walmart is a place where you buy things for your walls, that is an OG reality TV moment. But that is a little bit later. I think that's 2000 maybe, or a little bit after.
Right, so that's the 2000s. But that's where, going back to the film, that's where the film really juxtaposes against what is being portrayed. Now, Paris is very intelligent, but she plays a role in public because of anxiety that she experiences. So she leans into the blonde persona. She leans into the sort of baby voice. And that's a way of protecting herself. But when you see Paris in later years, more recently, she's remarkably intelligent. And the way that she's portrayed in The Simple Life and other spaces is, again, that vapid, fashion-obsessed blonde.
Mm-hmm.
This film's all about law school.
Yes.
You get your law degree, you get a Juris Doctorate. Or lawyers' doctors.
It is interesting that
we have doctorate in the title.
Yeah, but it is interesting how... if you know somebody who is an attorney, you're not this is my attorney, Dr. Smith. You're just this is my attorney, Jane Smith.
Oh, no. 3 of my best friends are attorneys, and they all refer to themselves as Dr. Asshole. I'm sorry, Asshole is the name I use for them on the text. So I'm just kind of wondering, once and for all, if we consider attorneys to be doctors. This gets back to a larger conversation about historians as doctors as well, right? Because I think most people consider physicians as doctors, and we know that that's the use of the term goes back to history far longer.
Right, but we have the audacity, we're 100% in that, the Lion, the Witch, and the audacity of this bitch to have these conversations ranking doctoral programs. We at Ed D, I hear a lot, well, that's not a real doctor. And so it's funny that we work in these diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, and yet we're taking pot shots at one another and ranking programs. Not to put a total, wet blanket on the whole thing, but it's interesting to me that we do this, and we're like, no, we believe in fairness and equality, unless you have an Ed D, in which case you're not as smart as me.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Like for an Ed D, I too know how to make a poster board. So I feel like, I'm kidding. I don't want to get, I don't care if I get canceled or not. Let's go with this, So if you're out there, you've got an Ed D, doctorate in education, is that right? So just come at me, bros.
I will tag you and send it to the listserv.
Do not do that in any form, kids. I'm playing along. One of the things I do find interesting, though, when I was thinking about, wow, well, maybe I should go get a law degree, or I could go get a PhD. And I was like, oh, they'll take about the same amount of time. Why was I wrong? And horribly wrong. Like, how long did it take you to get your PhDs? Because I remember thinking at the time, it's like, oh, I like law, but history seems cool. This shouldn't take me that much longer. And then it ranked amongst the worst decisions I've ever made. So I'm just kind of thinking about length of time to do that.
I started on my master's degree in 2012, finished that in 2014, and then started my PhD immediately after. And it took me, I guess, like 5 years from that point. So I graduated with my PhD in 2019. So I guess 7 years total.
I got my master's, took me 2 years, and then 6 years for PhD. So 8 years postgraduate.
My master's was 3 and then PhD was 7. But to be fair, and I've told you both this, I'm dumber than the two of you. So I feel like
6 years is about average. The problem is that it's offered, funding is offered for 4 years, and then you have to kind of figure out after the fact, and that's pretty standard that it's offered for 4 years. But the vast majority of individuals do not complete in less than 5 years' time, and the vast majority are around 6 and 7 years, just because of the amount of time that it's going to take to conduct the research and to write the dissertation.
And I think what people don't realize too is that, like, in the humanities, in history, like, we do all of this research ourselves. Like, in other fields, you are co-authoring articles with people, you're co-writing books with people, you have a bunch of people who are participating in the creation of a large scale project. But for us, like, even when we're talking about writing our books or our manuscripts, like, you're writing a 250-page book on your own. Like, and so that takes so much time to do that research, to create your arguments, to write these large manuscripts. And so that, I think, is why, it takes a long time for somebody to finish a dissertation or to write a book manuscript, especially compared to other fields.
Yeah, I felt like, when I was going through mine, I got done last year, like I said, it was 7 years. I took a year off when I moved down to Florida to teach in high school. But there were folks who were 2 or 3 years ahead of me who are still working on their PhDs now 10, 11, 12 years. To me, it seems like that's an extraordinarily long time for this. And I often wonder, like, are other countries where you can earn your PhD, are they moving faster? Or, like, it almost feels like it's too long. I would like to see the process kind of streamlined a bit.
Well, you have to think about, and this is something that we're all going to be facing as we come out of what the pandemic has taken from us, is the amount of time that you have available to you versus the amount of time where you can actually, I call it braining, but that you can actually write. You may have X amount of time in a day to write, but are there extenuating circumstances, food scarcity, stress about a partner, a family member, a job, a child, a pet, anything? Have you been doom scrolling? And are you not in the headspace? And so many of us deal with executive dysfunction, that it's not that we don't want to work. It's not that we aren't thinking about our projects. And one of the greatest pieces of advice I got when I walked into one of my advisor, John Neff, passed away, incredible scholar on Civil War memory. But John Neff's office was the space that I could go and cry, and he wouldn't make me feel bad about it and tell me that I needed to get my act together. He would just listen. And the advice that he gave me was that if you're thinking about your project, then you're writing. And some days that has to be enough. And that was so wonderful to hear and to carry with me, because I teach a 4-4 load. And my first few years, maybe I had a Thursday that was free, but I had done so much class prep and I had spent so much time in front of the classroom. And I'm not the kind of individual that gets a whole lot of energy by being out and about. I'm someone who gets tired. It's not that I don't enjoy it, but I get tired from it. And so that Thursday may not be a writing space. And then building that up and compounding it by beating myself up over not writing means that next Thursday is not a writing space. That becomes
lost
either.
Time, right? Yeah.
It's lost time. So I think that what we need to figure out as a discipline from the graduate level into the academy is having serious conversations about the ability to write and the ability to take the materials that we get from our archives to process them, especially when we're dealing with I didn't realize until after the fact how difficult, because I was working on colonial Virginia and Indigenous slavery, how difficult being in that archive was, and that I did need space away from it to process the darkness that I was reading, and to be away from it. It's like my students would always ask me about horror movies. I said, I don't have to watch them. I'm reading them. I'm not interested. That's not my spare time. That's not what I'm interested in pursuing. And that when you have these deadlines and this idea that you have to get things done, maybe you can, but I don't know that you're producing it at your best quality. And I don't know that it's not having an enormous toll. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Sadia Hartman talks about this, right? About the violence of the archive and how that affects you as a scholar as well. Jen, what about you? Did you have these kinds of same kind of things as, both not just as a graduate student, but now as an actual professor who is overseeing the development of students?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find a very, very emotionally taxing for me is I think it's so important for my students to understand, what Chris was saying, how the horrors of history affected the people who were involved, right? And so I'm not going to shy away from let's talk about the brutality of enslavement, or let's talk about the brutality of Indigenous enslavement. Let's talk about hard history in these classes, because reflecting upon that hard history is how you're going to grow as people, and how you're going to understand the world around you, and how you're going to graduate and move into your communities and try to make your communities, your cities, your states better places, how you're going to be really civically engaged individuals, and how you're going to try to make the world and your communities in which you live better places. But what I find very emotionally draining and difficult is, how do I teach this hard history in a way that is both very respectful of the people who were affected by this hard history historically, and also humanizes those people, and also conveys to the students, we cannot even begin to imagine to put ourselves in the experience of an enslaved person, for example. We cannot try to do that. We cannot, pretend that we understand what they were going through. However, we can try to educate ourselves in ways that allow us to see the world in which we live differently, and also the world in which we live as very much shaped by these historical events and the mistreatment of these human beings. historically. And so I find that to be very emotionally draining and difficult, trying to figure out that fine line of, I want to teach this hard history to students and I need to teach this hard history to students, but how do I do it in a way that's still very respectful of the fact that there are human beings involved in these historical discussions, and making sure that students understand that we're talking about human beings and their lived experiences and not these abstract historical figures that only exist on paper and are not pertinent to our present day discussions. So I find that to be really emotionally draining and difficult, in the same way often that like Chris is talking about when it comes to writing. Like I remember especially being a graduate student and just like beating myself up if I had a day where I felt like I didn't write enough, or I didn't write anything good, or I didn't make any kind of progress that day, especially when I was in that ABD dissertation only mode, just feeling like every day I need to sit down and write for 6 hours a day and produce something. And the pressure of that almost paralyzed me to the point of not being able to produce anything, because I just felt this weight of, well, this is my one responsibility, so I have to get it done. This is my job, so I have to be producing every day. And some days are just better than others. And I think that's just like human nature. You know, some days you feel like you could sit down and write and produce some really great paragraphs. Some days you feel like you can be a really great parent and connect with your kid. And then other days at the end of the day, you're like, man, I really didn't do a good job at that whole parenting thing today. Or I didn't really do a great job at that whole teaching thing today. Or I didn't really do a great job at the writing today. I didn't really get anything done. And I think now I'm realizing that that's okay. And like Chris said, I thought about it. You know, I recognize what I need to do, and I am just having a conversation or taking some time to think about my writing is good enough for that day. But yeah, I think it's human nature to feel like you always could do more, you always could do better. And that could be really detrimental for your mental health and do a lot more harm than good.
Yeah, I remember, and Kristalyn and I have been friends for a long time, so she knows a lot of these stories. When I was going through graduate school, I was 1,600 miles away from my kids. I was going through a divorce. I was super suicidal for a long time. And then I went to like, okay, now I have to write. Now I've got to read these 4 books this week for work. I'm not getting enough done. How do I get this stuff done? It's like, and you almost have to slow yourself down and go, and just like, hey, take it easy. You were also part of this story of this great human adventure, just like the folks that we are maybe writing about who have these histories of, any number of things, whether we're writing labor history, environmental history, whatever it is, right? You're also part of this story, right? And it's like you, of course, can be affected by any number of things. And it's almost like, yeah, if you write for an hour today, but 5 hours another day, or you write nothing today, it's like I had to I talked to a good friend of ours, Andrew Frank, at one point in time. He was like, it's okay. It's okay if you don't write today. It's going to come out in the aggregate. Just trust that. And, if there are graduate students listening now or other scholars who are listening, it's almost like it's a super important thing just to be able to say, it's okay to be a human during the process of writing this, because you're not a robot. It just doesn't come. And I certainly cannot sit down and write 8 to 5. I don't know about you guys.
Well, I think it goes back to, again, we were talking about in terms of what's represented again in the film of having an outlet and having a space where she can go to the nail salon and feel like she doesn't have to play the game there. It is so incredibly important to have outlets that are not academic in nature.
Yes.
And not to spend all of our time in the comparative culture of academia. Because just as gym bros are posting gains on social media, we too are posting all about, well, this is what I did and this is what I wrote today. And it's accountability, but it also can be, as you say, demoralizing to see, well, I should also be applying for that fellowship. I should also be writing, 500 words a day. I think it's now 1,000 words a day. And for some people, that structure works. And it is an incredible motivating space. but for others. And that's what you see, if we're giving advice, you got to figure out what motivates you. If comparison culture gets a fire in your belly and you want to go out there and that's what you like to do, that's what you thrive off of, then make sure that you're engaging in that. But if you know that it makes you feel ill or makes you feel bad about yourself, then that's something that you should actively work to avoid, and make sure that you have other outlets and spaces, and to be around people who aren't at all interested in the things that we spend all of our time, staring at and worrying about. We get in this habit of, we make fun of reality TV, but we also make fun of folks who like sports. And you know what? This is a really joyful week of disappointments and wins and bracket busting. And I highly recommend it. Don't take it too seriously, but have a little bit of fun and find interests that maybe are viewed as less than, but they're a heck of a lot of fun.
This is the thing I've actually really wrestled with a long time, which is the idea of like who I am. And Jenna had this wonderful thing she said earlier today about the idea of embracing the fact that she loves pop culture, right? This is like, for me, like, okay, history is, and I'd actually, and Chris, you talked a little bit about this performative nature about like, who am I? Like, I've often been like shy to post like pictures of gym culture on Twitter because I'm an academic and I'm a man. So therefore maybe that's too macho or anything like that and so forth. And eventually I was just like, fuck it. This is who I am, right? At the end of the day, I like Star Wars, but I also like lifting big, heavy things and I like to fish. And I also like history, but being a historian is not the single defining aspect of who I am. I'm an amalgamation of all this bullshit, and I'm just going to embrace all of it. Let me bring this full circle. Is Legally Blonde a history film?
Isn't our argument that all films are history films?
That's my argument. Yes, and I don't really argue so much as dictate, but yes.
I mean, at this point, we've come so full circle that my child is able to go into the archive of my closet and be fashionable. So it's 100% a history film.
To be fair, your child is maybe the most fashionable person I've ever seen.
She's pretty awesome.
She's fairly awesome, yes. Jen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a history film. I think like now, obviously looking back 20 years or however many years it's been since Legally Blonde came out, like for sure it is like a historical moment in time that we get to relive every time we watch the movie. But I think there are so many important themes of the movie that represent like the history of women and the history of gender and like are breaking a lot of these barriers like we've talked about today. So yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say along the line of historians at the movies, yeah, every movie is a history film, but this one actually I think is.
Hell yeah.
Well, think about when it came out, Jason. It came out in the summer of 2001. And it's, the world changes significantly, September 2001. And I was living in Cincinnati and deciding whether I wanted to go to grad school for history or law school. And so I was working at a law firm, and it was in the Crew Tower in downtown Cincinnati, the largest building. And that summer had been this, I just graduated from Bowling Green, the Bowling Green of Ohio, not the Bowling Green of Kentucky. You try to figure out my life, having a lot of fun and very different energy when I went off to graduate school in Chicago the following spring after 9/11. And so in my mind, and I bet you in a lot of people's minds, this film and that summer and the type of popular culture that came out that was still very much in the vein of 90s rom-coms and, a lot of frivolity really disappeared for quite some time in the American popular culture landscape in the wake of the War on Terror and in the wake of 9/11. So if we were teaching this in a class, if we were talking about it in the class, that's how I would frame it, to talk about this as the end of the 90s to a certain extent. And I think that's why the 90s and the early 2000s are so popular now, because they're, for this generation, they're pre-Watergate. That's why our generation, folks, very late Gen X, very early millennial, looked so fondly back on the 60s, pre-scandal, pre-end of Vietnam. We're
end of the innocence kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And that's where if I were going to throw this into if I was teaching a second half survey or, talking about this within the realm of historical memory and popular culture, where it would fit, and ask them to think about the tone of how the world changes in terms of popular culture and American representation.
I love that response. I think that's so spot on. I think you're totally spot on with that, Chris.
I think in the spirit of academia, I shall now rephrase all of that and claim it as my own idea.
It's what you do all the time, so have a good time.
Damn! That hurts. I mean, it's what I do all the time, but, so. All right. Kristalyn Shefveland, Jennifer McCutchen, thank you both so much for being here today. I cannot thank you enough for being here on this podcast. Thank you for being a friend. We've traveled down those roads, back again. Your heart is true. Your pals and your confidants.
Gotta always make it about Florida, don't you?
Something like that. I'm hitting stop. And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies Podcast. Thank you so much to our guests today, Kristalyn Shefveland and Jennifer McCutchen. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, and to you for continuing to listen in, to share this with your friends via text, via Twitter, Facebook, whether it's on Spotify, iTunes, or anywhere else you're listening. Thank you so much. This show continues to grow. We are moving up in the world, so please continue to spread the gospel of HATM. It means the world to me. You can find HATM every single Sunday night. Looking out on Twitter, just Google the hashtag HATM or look for me on Twitter at Herbert History. In the meantime, between now and then, keep following along. Thank you for continuing to be part of this, and we will see you again. Ciao for now.